Welcome back, everyone. I hope you each had a little opportunity for some rest and moving around a bit, getting the kinks out. We're entering now our final afternoon period of the symposium, and we're going to be having a panel discussion. I'll say a couple more things about that as we get that started. But first of all, we'll begin with some guided meditation that Richie Davidson, again, will kindly provide some guidance for us.
Thank you, and welcome back, everyone. So let's begin by taking our postures, sitting upright, not too tight and not too loose. And as we settle into this last period of practice together, let's again remind ourselves why we are here. And reflecting on how these practices are of benefit not only for our own well-being, but for the welfare of all the other beings with whom we connect with, directly or indirectly. So let's spend the first few moments together sitting with this motivation and seeing if we can connect with this altruistic intent. Now let's spend the first few minutes together in open awareness, fully present, awake, aware, not focusing on any one thing in particular, without any need to change our experience, simply resting in this basic, precious quality of awareness. And simply noticing whatever might arise. Feelings, thoughts, sensations. Now let's together reflect for a moment on our desire to be happy and to be free of suffering. Every human being, and really every being, shares this same wish to be happy and content and to be free from suffering. And think of another being. A person, could even be an animal, and bring them into your mind and your heart. And reflect on how they too share this same wish to be happy and to be free of suffering, just like you. And then think, I will meditate to discover my true nature so that I can help this person and all others discover their true nature and discover lasting happiness and well-being. I will meditate to discover my true nature so that I can help this person or being discover their true nature and enjoy lasting happiness and well-being. So let's see if we can bring one or two people into our mind and into our heart as we reflect together on the universality of this basic wish to be happy and to be free of suffering, and dedicate ourselves to meditating so that we can be helpful in enabling others to discover their true nature and enjoy lasting happiness. I will meditate to discover my true nature so that I can be helpful to all other beings in finding lasting happiness and well-being. Whatever words feel most comfortable, or no words is fine too. Leaning into this altruistic motivation for our practice. In the last few minutes of practice together, let's bring into our mind and our heart one or two or several beings who've played some role in enabling us to show up together here today. And allowing this sense of appreciation to emerge for the role they've played in nurturing our development, in nurturing our journey on this path. And as we always do in any session of practice, however short it might be, let us dedicate whatever merit, whatever insight, whatever learning we may have gleaned from our time together, and make an unswerving commitment to bring this out into the world for the benefit of others. In whatever way might be appropriate for each of our contexts. Forming a sincere intention to bring into the crevices of everyday life the awareness and the connection and so much else that we may have gleaned from our time together. And as we transition into this final session, and for those of you whose eyes have been closed, you can please open them. And let us practice in this transition to retain the same quality of awareness and bring this sensibility to our discussion and to everything beyond. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to the next session.
Thank you very much, Richie. Very appreciative. In beginning our final panel discussion, I simply wish to remind everyone that this Varela International Symposium is being made available through the graces of Upaya Zen Center. Roshi and her organizational skills and all of the work behind the scenes of Noah, of the Upaya residents, and of course out into the world of all of our translators. And as you know, this is being made available without charge. Nonetheless, Upaya has, of course, many ongoing expenses. Its revenue stream from in-person retreats, etc., ended in early March. And so your generosity in dana contributions to Upaya would be most gratefully accepted. Thank you. We're going to begin with having some comments from Alyssa Eppel from the University of California, San Francisco, who, as many of you know, is an extraordinary investigator in a number of areas, especially having to do with stress and aging, including the cellular consequences of stress. And so her interest in how many of these things, she of course has also done some contemplative studies, how all of this comes to bear upon things of very practical importance to us is among the many reasons why we wanted her on the faculty for this. And then also Wendy Hassenkamp, a neuroscience investigator who is with the Mind and Life Institute as well as University of Virginia, who similarly has done some outstanding research having to do with brain connectivity and how that changes with long-term meditation, as well as some other research. So I want to turn it over to Alyssa and Wendy to offer us some comments, and then we're going to broaden to our other faculty. By the way, we are not taking questions in the Q&A box during this particular session, but fear not. We've been looking at all of those. We discussed them over the break, and we have been motivated by those in the way we've constructed how we're going to go about the discussion. So hopefully many of you will hear your questions addressed during the comments of the faculty in this panel. So Alyssa and Wendy.
Thank you so much, Al, for all of your work planning this seamless, amazing few days, so rich. Thank you to all the speakers and the audience with us. So I wanted to offer some of my perspectives as a stress scientist and really just start with this context that we're all sharing of this global pandemic. My question really is, how can we best serve different people? What are different people's needs right now? The metaphor I find very helpful is one storm, many boats. We're all exposed to this similar traumatic foreboding situation. And we each have different resources, material, social, our own internal resources, the level of development of our own resilience. And so it's helpful to think about awareness in this context. So I'm going to weave in some of the concepts we've heard from the different speakers with the question of how can we use this wisdom to be of most help at this moment in history. So as Al mentioned, stress has a automatic bad name. I've contributed to some of that reputation because we're really talking about that chronic ongoing stress that wears us down and impairs our health. But the stress response is so beautiful and helpful. And now is a time, now that it is going to be with us in a strong way for a while, to embrace it. And the only way we can work with stress and harness it is with the types of awareness we've been discussing, the metacognitive awareness of how our mind works. So without this, we have panic, we have the worst of human behavior, we have traumatic reactions that stay with us, and cognitions such as, this is, an apocalypse, this is the worst, things are going down. So these mental habits that are on automatic mode when we don't have metacognition are most well exemplified when we think of clinical anxiety and depression. The habit loops, the cognitive affective networks that get activated and trapped so that we can't control our emotional state. Metacognitive awareness, the training that we've been talking about, particularly Richie, is actually what leads us to self-regulate as well as co-regulate others. So there is a story Thich Nhat Hanh tells about the refugee boat, the crowded boat on the tumultuous seas, and who made it and who didn't. And he says if one person on that boat had the calmness, the boat would survive, everyone would survive. And so we've been talking about something, but we haven't named it. And that is that when we can have the insight into our own mind and self-regulate, we actually are a contagious agent for promoting that type of emotion in others, positive emotion, attention, support. So one thing I have learned very dramatically in the last 3 months is that what you do in the midst of acute trauma and stress is different than what we do as mental health clinicians. And so I want to bring up Richie's pillars of attention, insight, connection, and purpose. And it is a beautiful intertwined package. But in the midst of acute stress and trauma, I want to bring up the concept that Roshi Joan teaches, which is compassionate presence. What everyone agrees on is that in the midst of this, such as what we're going through this week in America, feeling the pain of seeing brothers murdered and sisters, is something that is collective and is a what we can do for each other. And so it's collective resilience is the concept I want us to think about when we think about our mind and our co-regulation of others' emotions and attention, when we can rise up to that. So we've heard about different types of metacognition and attention, and I would love more discussion of how we can think about those, use those, discuss those. Jonathan Schooler talked about open mindfulness, having this sense of openness to new experience and curiosity. Kalina talked about this open mind wandering that's not discursive from an intentional task, but rather a natural human process that unlinks us, deconditions us from the ruminative thought, the cognitive affective networks. So these natural processes are part of our discussion that are important for us to explore how we can use these more in our life and clinically. Another concept that Jay brought up is cognitive illusion. I want to hear about cognitive illusion from fourth graders. This is such a fundamental concept about how we work and think. That why is it relegated to the elite halls of, philosophy and Buddhism classes? and cognitive psychology. So I look to Richie because and others who are doing this developmental education work, because I do think that this is a way we can easily bring this into mainstream life and change how we think, the architecture of our cultural created realities that we create. So one of our participants said, can't we use that white triangle? Now I cannot not see that white triangle. Isn't that waking me up? Don't we need that for more of us to be woke? And my answer is yes, bring that in. John, that was a great exercise. And people don't learn that till college in psychology, but that should be a fundamental class. How early can we teach that? Okay, so I will just end with saying that the stress response is to be welcomed, explored, regulated, and co-regulated. And the habits, the unconscious automatic habits that we're prone to, I will leave it to Wendy to just talk more about what she sees in how to unpack these habits of the mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. Wonderful.
Thank you, Alyssa. And thanks so much, Al, Roshi, all the presenters. It's just such an honor and joy to be here with all of you. Each of you have been a teacher to me in some ways. So this is just wonderful. Yeah, so I'll just follow that thread a little bit that, that Alyssa was starting there about habits. I think just as she was saying, without awareness, we're stuck in these habitual patterns, which are often the source of so much of our suffering. And I think that's a thread that I've seen running through all the discussions, the talks at this event. And I'll just pull out a couple of examples. So Jonathan began by speaking about different levels of awareness, and he had that great picture of the brain with most of it submerged underwater, suggesting that so much of what's operating is below the level of what we know. And Kalina, similarly, in her network diagram, there was the awareness in certain networks, but there were other networks that weren't really accessible oftentimes to our awareness, and those in fact can constrain. She started to get into how those can constrain our mental experience through these kind of habitual patterns. So I think that habits is a term that can be used in so many ways, and we can think about it in a really broad perspective in relation to all of these talks. We can think about it, like Alyssa said, for example, with rumination or depression, these kinds of negative habitual patterns, other forms of emotional patterning that show up in relationship to others, biases about different groups is certainly a form of patterning and habits, beliefs about ourself, coming to John and Jay, belief that there is a self, this very deep structure of patterning in our conscious experience of the kind of subject-object divide, and the fact that that leads to this experience of a self that then becomes reified. That's a very deep kind of patterning. We mentioned a number of ways of societal and cultural patternings and habits, and that they become norms, and how those are often, they begin to be formed when we're very young. So I think there are so many different ways to think about and look at these patterns, but it seems like a common thread underneath all of us is like, how do we create change? How do we address these patterns? And I think that much of the change that we're seeking is going to require the awareness of the patterns that are operating if we want to affect that change. And Richie so helpfully pointed out that awareness is an opportunity, for example, to minimize bias, but I think an opportunity to make any kind of change in these habitual systems. So I think that just this idea of the role of awareness in our ability to change, and of course the potential of contemplative practice as one way to cultivate that kind of awareness and intentionally maybe repattern, create healthy habits. There's obviously a lot of growing evidence that these practices are useful for reducing automaticity in all kinds of ways, whether it's rumination or there's a growing literature on reducing implicit bias. So I think there's a lot of exciting potential there and thinking about habits, and there may be other ways. Kalina raised the issue of psychedelics that generated some interesting discussions. So I think that will be interesting to dig into, and also just want to nod to the idea that contemplative practices and most of these things that we're discussing are kind of operating at the level of changing individual minds, and then just thinking about the relationship of what is the relationship of change at the individual level to move to the societal level, or how does that relate to, you know, societal and structural change that we've also been discussing. So those are just some of the threads that have come up for me. So I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. You know, it wasn't very long ago that within the sciences of mind, we considered meta-awareness, if we considered it at all, to be rather unitary. And I think what you've been hearing a number of our presenters talk about today is considerable nuance in regard to meta-awareness, that it may very well not be a single process or have a single or a small set of correlates within brain. So it would be interesting to hear a bit more of that. And in regard not only to how these nuances of meta-awareness differ from what is outside of consciousness, but also why it's of importance. Why does it matter in some practical way to us? So if I could, perhaps let's call on Jonathan to begin that, and then we'll also bring some others into the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really an exciting prospect to begin to explore the landscapes of meta-awareness, the various different ways in which we can take stock of our minds. I think that already when I was first thinking about this, I guess in 2000, I distinguished between unconscious processing, monitoring, and meta-aware. But I think it's interesting, this has come up before, that the unconscious monitoring may itself be a kind of meta-awareness. So thinking about unconscious meta-awareness, I think is perfectly reasonable, and so much of what we end up monitoring involves unconscious. And in fact, it may be that one of the real challenges is to develop habits where things that are initially require meta-awareness become so automatized that they then become second nature, and we no longer need to think about them. There are all sorts of things. I mean, even as we in conversation, you know, the challenge of when is the right time to interject, something that we have, you know, gradually learned to do. But you can just imagine so many developing practices of being explicit at first and then gradually automatizing them. I think that would be a very exciting dimension to further explore. The topic that John and I have been investigating of learning how to maintain a intuitive meta-awareness, non-propositional, which Richie believes is 20 or maybe 24/7. I'm not sure what you think about the contemplatives, if they're in intuitive meta-awareness even when they're sleeping, Richie. But I think that's a really fascinating prospect, that we can develop a kind of always knowing what's going on in our minds through contemplative practice is really a fascinating prospect. The idea that the meta-awareness that we apply to ourselves may also be applied to thinking about others and looking at the relationship between meta-awareness and social experiences, I think is absolutely fundamental. And it's a really exciting prospect that, in addition to learning to be better at regulating ourselves through cultivating meta-awareness, we may also be more skilled at appreciating our interactions with others. And I'm fascinated to see Richie's paper, which I guess is in press suggesting that we're actually discovering anatomical differences in different types of meta-awareness. And I think complementing the subjective experiences of meta-awareness by investigating their underpinning brain architectures is a really exciting development. So those are some of the thoughts I've had about different kinds of meta-awareness we may want to consider.
Thank you, Jonathan. Kalina, do you have something you'd like to add to that?
I do. Thank you so much, Al, for opening with that topic. And I want to thank both Jonathan and Richie for mentioning some things that just helped me connect some concepts in my mind and add a neuroscientific perspective on that. As Richie was talking about the possibly different forms of meta-awareness, it occurred to me that something I did not mention during my talk, but I should have, is that just like Richie said, the frontal-parietal control network is very important for a very particular kind of meta-awareness, which has to do with meta-awareness of one's thoughts. However, there is some really interesting work. A lot of it was initiated and done by Hugo Critchley's lab on meta-awareness of physiological signals. Hugo Critchley brilliantly did an experiment looking at what parts of the brain support meta-awareness of one's own heartbeat. The region of the brain that's come out as a very important for that is quite far from the cortex. It's the anterior insular cortex. And if you look at it, it's even its structure neuroscientifically is very different from the cortical structure. The cortex has 6 layers of neurons. The insula only has 4 layers. It's a very ancient subcortical structure that's very tightly linked to our physiology. And so it occurs to me that this is absolutely one of the candidates of meta-awareness that is not usually thought of when we think about meta-awareness. We tend to be biased towards considering the meta-awareness of our cognitive states and emotional states. By the way, the emotional states themselves have much more propositional nature to them. There's a different set of systems in the cortex, usually zeroing around the medial prefrontal cortex. The most anterior part of the medial prefrontal cortex is what's usually linked to emotional meta-awareness. And yet there's this third kind of meta-awareness around our physiology, very low level, which it occurs to me may very well link to John's idea about the non-propositional meta-awareness.
Thank you, Kalina. And I'm so glad you brought up that point about meta-awareness and our viscera. Very interesting that the historical Buddha taught as the first of the 4 foundations of mindfulness of the body. I'm very curious about what, from the perspective of Buddhist thought, especially earlier Buddhist thought, what that might have to say about this consideration of the nuance of how we regard meta-awareness. So John and Jay, if either of you have something to say about that, maybe beginning with John.
Sure. Actually, it's interesting. The person I'd really like to have here to answer that question would be Bhikkhu Analayo, who's been writing some great articles in this regard and who really kind of tries to distinguish what's happening in the early period of Buddhism as opposed to what develops then in Theravada theory. And he sees a kind of significant difference between those. He's written just recently an article because of a conversation we had about this idea of samprajanya, which kind of has this very clear shift that occurs in Mahayana texts, where it starts to mean this kind of monitoring awareness. And as Jay points out, it's connected to this idea of, in Pali called appamada, or in Sanskrit apramada, which is heedfulness. In other words, I'm monitoring, but I'm monitoring in the context of a kind of set of ethical and ethical norms and goals. In other words, a kind of task set that is guiding this monitoring, if you like. So that there's definitely evidence of something like that in the early period, but there's some lack of a clear kind of philosophical toolkit that enables one to really speak very clearly about meta-awareness in that way. At least that would be my impression. It's really not until, in some ways, not until all the way until the 4th or 5th century that a kind of clear philosophical toolkit that includes the idea of reflexivity. Before that emerges, it's tough to talk about this kind of meta-awareness. What I will say, though, is that there's something implicit, and part of what's, I think, implicit in Buddhist practice is the idea that there are signals, just to respond a little bit to what else we've been talking about here. There are, you could say, signals that we're receiving that are not really propositional signals, if you like. I'm using the metaphor of a signal. In other words, how, as I'm speaking to someone, my affective state is actually information in a certain way, especially in a social situation. The kinds of facial expressions that I'm seeing and that I am even quite possibly mirroring, the empathic relationship to the other person. These are being presented to us not as kind of, overt propositional judgments, but rather as a sort of frame around which an event, especially a social interchange, is occurring. And that information is just as rich, or in some ways richer, than what we are saying with our words. And I think part of when we think about meta-awareness and consciousness, and this again is where it gets really interesting even in early Buddhism, is like, what exactly do we mean by conscious? Is it, if I have some, in the work that that we've done in the lab on masked faces that Richie showed, is it really that I'm completely unconscious of the affective priming, or is that, if under the right conditions, would I even be able to report on that? I feel a little uncomfortable or something. So that I guess part of what I'm trying to get at is that the dividing line between conscious and unconscious, which is a really important issue in Buddhism in general, including early Buddhism, that dividing line is really not that clear. If we just say conscious means something I can report on in a proposition like a judgment, that's a pretty impoverished version of consciousness. And it seems to me that meta-awareness maybe has to do with a different way of thinking about what it means to be conscious and where that dividing line stands.
Thank you very much, John. Jay, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, and once again, I'm largely in agreement with John, which is always surprising and always nice. Buddhist philosophers are always railing against reification. One form of reification we see in a lot of contemporary discourse is going from, as John just put it, being conscious of something to talking about consciousness, and then looking for that thing that is consciousness, instead of asking in what different ways can we be conscious and in what different senses can we use the term conscious. And the same thing I think is true of being aware. It's one thing to be aware and to be meta-aware. It's another thing to reify that into a single construct called awareness or meta-awareness. And that kind of reification, I think, is one of the things that Buddhist philosophers correctly advise us against. When I'm thinking about what it is to be meta-aware, I'm thinking there isn't a single thing. And I think that literature on skill acquisition is really very useful here. In the Chan tradition, we have this wonderful distinction between acting thoughtlessly, acting with thought, and acting without thought. It's one thing not even to have enough understanding to act intelligently. It's another to have enough explicit knowledge to guide yourself cognitively. But a real virtuoso isn't doing that. I always say that one of the things that Buddhism is about is not about virtuous living. It's about virtuoso living, about living in a way that is spontaneous and doesn't require the constant instructions and monitoring. A lot of this comes out as well in the Taoist tradition. If any of you are familiar with the Zhuangzi and this great story of Butcher Ding, who's talking about what it is to cut oxen. And says, when I first began cutting oxen, all I could see were the parts of oxen. And after cutting oxen for a while, I just saw the whole ox, and now I don't see anything at all. And my blade just goes through the empty spaces. But he points out, when I reach a hard part, Then I pause and I think and I reflect, and then I find myself going further, which reminds us of the non-duality of explicit awareness and more implicit awareness. One of the things we need to become skilled at is knowing when to bring explicit conscious thought to bear and when not, because sometimes it gets in the way. Try uttering a sentence while thinking about English grammar and about which words should come next. It's really hard to talk while you're doing that. What verb should I use now? Speech, for those who are expert, works much better without explicit meta-awareness. But that doesn't mean I'm not aware of what I'm speaking. And it doesn't mean I'm not aware of what I'm speaking. It means there's a very different set of processes brought to bear that allows spontaneous expert performance. So I think that when we're talking about what it is to be meta-aware, we need to be distinguishing between real self-monitoring, between higher order thought, between thoughtful action that involves a kind of awareness of what we're doing, but doesn't involve this kind of these explicit processes, and perhaps a host of other processes, awareness, the way that we are aware of affect, the way that we're aware of frame. We know that the way that we are aware of faces, human faces, is very different from the way that we're aware of other things. And so I think we need to be willing to stop talking about a single thing or even a small group of things called meta-awareness and begin asking about the different kinds of contexts, objects, and mechanisms by which we're aware of things, both in unskilled and in skilled performance, in cognitive domains, affective domains, interpersonal domains. And then we're going to begin to get some of the texture that we need to get going here. But the first step, I think, is the de-reification.
Thank you very much for that, Jay. So you brought up, in regard to some of the nuance of meta-awareness, some of those areas where maybe it's not so helpful. And we've been focusing mostly on the benefits of meta-awareness. So I think it might be useful to explore in a little bit more depth, where is meta-awareness beneficial and where is it less so? And Richie, if I might call on you to respond first of all, because you had a couple of things to say about that in your talk.
Thank you, Al, and thank you all for this really juicy conversation. And this is one of those conversations where if we were in person, we'd be interrupting each other, but we have to be more polite on Zoom. So, so to your question, Al, about the potential deleterious consequences of meta-awareness, I want to just bring up something that several have mentioned, and Jay, I think, underscored it very, very nicely and clearly, which is that meta-awareness is not one thing. And the way I think about meta-awareness is, in addition to all of the granularity that has already been articulated, we can think of it as graded. When meta-awareness is first being cultivated, it may be, in fact, deleterious in certain contexts. And so I think it's really important that we not use these limited domains where meta-awareness may be deployed by individuals who are relatively untrained in their mind to make inferences in general, like big statements about whether meta-awareness is beneficial or not beneficial. And so I think this is where Jay's idea of virtuoso performance is applicable. If we study virtuosos, I think we would find that meta-awareness is not deleterious, but these are individuals in whom meta-awareness has been so well trained that it arises spontaneously. And it is, if you will, part of the new baseline, the new default mode. This is what Dan Goleman and I have called an altered trait. which is an enduring change. And that, I think, is relatively rare. But when we do study these virtuoso performances, we see that, first of all, some of the neural machinery which has been implicated in meta-awareness is activated extremely transiently. We published a paper many years ago in PNAS on exactly this, where we found that the extremely practiced meditators, and these were folks with more than 30,000 hours of lifetime practice, had an initial transient increase in prefrontal activation during a task which requires meta-awareness, and then it comes right back down to baseline. And this we interpreted as a neural echo of expertise, of virtuoso performance. Whereas the meditators who had between 10 and 30,000 hours, still quite a bit, were ones that showed a much more sustained activation of prefrontal cortex in this context. And so I think that this is an important data point in helping us to parse this. And so I think it's really important that we keep this heterogeneity of meta-awareness in mind when we talk about this. And I would agree with Jay about the importance of not reifying this as one thing.
Thank you so much,
I'd love
Richie.
to. Al, could I ask Richie a question? And also,
Absolutely.
John and Jay, just curious about the training that one engages in as a meditation practitioner in noticing and naming states that one is passing through, so to speak. So that is one kind of meta-awareness that is strongly emphasized in Buddhist practice, this kind of awareness of our subjectivity. That subjectivity can widen to be more inclusive, but being aware of bodily states, being aware of the changing flow of emotions, being aware of thoughts changing, and so on and so forth. I mean, this has been part of my training as well, but it is in fact not emphasized in Zen. Zen has a completely opposite approach, which is to be in, if you will, a kind of preconscious state where you're not naming, you're not developing any narrative. You're simply sitting in a natural state. So I'm just curious about what, the perspective is of the scientists and philosophers who are gathered here on this particular training process that many of us have experienced.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating question. I'd love to hear from my Buddhist scholar colleagues, but I can just say that that the naming process is one of many different modes of teaching, and I think that it actually can it is not necessary, let's put it that way, at all for the development of meta-awareness. And in the traditions in which I'm most familiar, one of the qualities of the kind of meta-awareness that's cultivated is a quality of vastness, where the aperture is essentially infinite. I mean, it becomes infinite. It's vast. And so when we did these pain experiments, where we presented, a super intense heat stimulus that was really painful, one of the comments of our very, very long-term practitioners is, yes, I noticed exactly when that arose. I had, complete awareness of it, but it was in this vast panorama, and it would be like being out in a beautiful field with tremendous sunlight, and then someone shines a candle, and you notice the candle, but it's in the midst of all this other light. So it's hardly a blip. And that is the kind of panoramic awareness that I think these very long-term practitioners rest in completely spontaneously.
Well, I bring this up in part because I think it's interesting to consider the deleterious aspects of this kind of monitoring, this sort of a process that we engage in of objectifying or reifying our subjective experience. And so, you know, whether it's at the somatic level or otherwise, I think it's important to you know, look at the challenge that some practitioners face, that they become so absorbed in their mental processes. They're looking up their problems in the PDR, you know, they're tracking their symptomatology, and it becomes a kind of obsession of self-absorption.
I
Yeah,
agree. I mean, I think that that can have really deleterious consequences. And I'm not convinced that that kind of process is optimal for most people, at least in cultivating this kind of broad meta-awareness. But I also, you know, one of the important things to recognize that I always say is that one size does not fit all.
That's right. No, we agree with that.
maybe I should say, I saw Jonathan had his hand up, and maybe I
Yeah.
should say a little bit about the process of training.
Yeah, I just want to mention the other piece, and that has to do with focused attention. And that is, you know, this hyper focus, you know, could be on our somatic experience or some mental process. I think, you know, the same issues are involved with the cultivation of focused attention.
Well, one way of thinking about both historically and then in terms of a training regimen about how one would cultivate meta-awareness is actually that in a certain way, any practice that involves needing to monitor the state of the mind, which is pretty much going to be almost any contemplative practice, is going to cultivate some form of meta-awareness. And when we think about focused attention styles of practice, the idea would be that initially, you have, in order for us to, the idea would be to sustain attention on an object without distraction, which means you have to notice when you're distracted, which therefore means you need some kind of monitoring that enables to notice distraction. But in techniques that are really very emphasizing this focus, this one-pointed focus, or ekagrata in Sanskrit, then actually you stop monitoring. In fact, you don't want meta-awareness because it's understood to be interfering with the focus. But there's another way of doing this, which you find in the Mahamudra traditions, which is that you have an object that you're focusing on, but then and you're monitoring for distraction, and distraction just means attention capture. The attention has been captured by something unintended on the object, and then and so you're monitoring, and then you actually lessen the focus more and more and more until you just have the monitoring in a certain way. Of course, that can still be very dualistic, but this starts to move toward that kind of panoramic awareness that Richie's talking about. So that one way to train, especially in the more gradual approaches, one way to train this kind of meta-awareness is you start with an object, but you actually emphasize that meta-awareness more and more until you can eventually just drop the object altogether. And this is very different than a noting style of practice, which also has a role there and can be used to develop meta-awareness. But the problem with a noting practice, like this is anger, or this is that, is that because it's propositional, that means that it actually is, in a sense, interfering also with this kind of more panoramic meta-awareness, because it's flipping you back into a very dualistic state of mind, because it's a judgment, and those judgments are necessarily dualistic. So every time I'm doing noting, I'm actually not on the object anymore. I'm objectifying my own experience, and I'm completely dualistic. So it would help to develop meta-awareness, but it's at some point really going to be an obstacle to that more panoramic meta-awareness that Richie's talking about.
Yeah, which again just underlines the fact that when we say that we're being meta-aware, what we've done is named a class of processes, not a process. And so there may be very different mechanisms and very different senses in which we're meta-aware depending upon the contemplative technique. And to say that it's just meta-awareness and ask whether it's in this technique or that technique is going to be completely misleading.
Can I just jump in here?
Please, Jonathan.
I wanted to speak to Roshi Jones' question about the labeling with a little bit of research. One thing I would just wanted to re-mention was this idea of verbal overshadowing. We've done a lot of research showing that when people describe experiences, it can actually interfere with their access to the nonverbal one. And one example of labeling was a study I've done in collaboration with Maria Brandimonti, in which people saw forms which looked like things. And then they either looked at those forms going la, 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 so preventing verbal labeling or not. And then afterwards, they were asked to visualize the form and then remove one part and see what was left. And what was found was that when people did the la, 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 they were actually better at removing one part and seeing what the remaining part was. So when the label seems to reduce flexibility, when you label it, you translate it into a particular form, remember that representation, and then you lack the capacity to see it from some other perspective. Also, there's research Matt Lieberman has done looking at labeling of emotions and finding that when people label emotions, it seems to lead to a dampening of them, which might be useful in some senses, but also could be problematic in others. So there really is potent impact of labeling.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Fascinating. Thank you, Jonathan. Kalina, did you have anything else you would like to add to this conversation?
Oh, just very quickly, and that was really interesting, just to add on some of the neuroscience around labeling, which is as part of that study that I told you about with meditators. We did have a second question, which unfortunately we didn't have a lot of data in it to publish a really reliable analysis. The second question was, what was the thought that arose? And it was labeled as one of 4 categories: narrative, somatic, body, visual, or auditory. And it turns out that people don't have these in equal proportion. The narrative thoughts are much higher. It differs across individuals as well. But one interesting thing that we saw, which we published in a chapter rather than a paper because of the reliability issues, was that as those thoughts arise before they're even experienced, you can already see what they will be based on the neural markers. If it will be labeled as a visual thought, the visual cortex will be activated before people report it as a visual. If it's somatic, you get different structures. If it's verbal, you get different structures and so forth. And I think the labeling in that sense could be a very helpful practice, in the sense that it opens up vistas to your experience that you may not have otherwise perceived, in the sense that it amplifies different experiences and you become more perceptive of the different qualities of your own arising of your thoughts. So that could be one benefit. But I also want to second the benefit that Jonathan pointed out in terms of labeling itself could produce a more flexible potentiality for a mental state, because as you label it and you note it, you decrease the chance of that mental state chaining to another one in a habitual way that you have evolved, that you have developed. So going back to that deconditioning of the connectivity and of the connections between mental states that sometimes can be harmful, the labeling part can be very helpful. And I do think that is a form of meta-awareness that is, as Richie pointed out, produces some flexibility, because you become, the labeling helps enhance the meta-awareness of those states. And through that, it has the potential to increase your flexibility by deconditioning the next thought from arising.
Thanks, Kalina. I was going to shift our focus to another topic, though it's related. But before I do, any of the other faculty who would like to have something to say about this issue of benefits versus difficulties of meta-awareness? So the topic I wanted to draw us toward now, a number of you made reference to issues having to do with the social sphere of functioning, raising questions about cooperation, autonomy, and of course implications for ethics. So rather than call on anyone in particular, let me open it up. Who would like to begin in addressing some of this?
I could say something a little bit, but I'd like to hear from Richie sometime very soon. I think it's important when we look at ethics from a Buddhist perspective to recognize that what we're doing is cultivating ways of experiencing the world, ways of experiencing ourselves, ways of experiencing others, ways of experiencing everything around us. And that cultivation of a kind of moral perception is a very special thing. It's a cultivation of skills. And we can often summarize those skills in the four Brahma Viharas, the divine states, the skill of being friendly to others, the skill of caring for others, the skill of rejoicing in others' success, and the skill of being impartial. And what these have in common is that they decenter us. They take us out of the center of our moral universe. We're no longer the middle pole with everything seen in a kind of polar coordinate system in relationship to us. And to do that, you really have to work on the idea of self and the idea of agency, because it's the idea of self, the reification of self, and the creation of subject-object duality that lies behind the instinct to see the world morally with ourselves in the center and with our own immediate egoistic interests as having a kind of default weight. And so I honestly believe that even though it sounds very abstract, all of this discussion of selflessness and of subject-object duality and of the cognitive illusion of why that view of the universe isn't just morally reprehensible, but it's erroneous, and that you really have to uproot it in order to make the moral progress is really important. So I see all of this as foundationally ethical.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you, Jay. Richie, do you have a response?
Thank you. Well, I certainly very much agree with that perspective. And let me make, if I can, a brief connection between the previous discussion of meta-awareness and this discussion of ethics. I think that one of the most important components of meta-awareness in the framework in which we're talking about it is the part of being meta-aware for a practitioner is being meta-aware of the view. So that the view is infused with every aspect of experience. And it is the lens through which we view the world and the lens through which all our experience occurs. And it is, it's that quality of remembering. And my Buddhist scholar friends can help me with this, but yeah, I believe it is the case that the very word mindfulness,
Smriti.
I think
Smriti. Then
has the quality of remembering, and it is remembering the view. And so this, I think, is exceedingly important, and it is one of the principal reasons why meta-awareness needs to be cultivated in an ethical context, in a context of the view, because it is that view which is to be remembered at every moment. And that is the, it's really the union of emptiness and wisdom.
Can I add one thing here, though, that may be a bit challenging in this context, which is that at the same time, especially you look at, let's say, a tradition like Mahmudra Dzogchen, and when you're doing the actual practice, and here we need to be very careful to distinguish between actual practice time and then what you do off the cushion. during the actual practice time, the idea again is to be starting to cultivate an awareness that's not fixated in that dualistic structure. And one of the things that gets us the most dualistically fixated is ethics. So that moral judgments feel much more important than many other kinds of judgments. And there's some work in empirical philosophy that suggests that our moral framework, when people are asked, like, if you were an inch shorter, or you had blue hair, or you lost an ear, would you still be the same person? They'll say, yeah, sure, or you suddenly decide you don't like pasta anymore. But if you change your moral framework, suddenly you're not the same person anymore.
Right.
So there's a way in which moral judgment actually can really be very fixating for us. So that doesn't mean that we abandon ethics at all, but it means that part of that style of practice is, again, learning to see the contingency of our ethics and to not reify our ethics in such a way that they actually become part of the problem.
Oh yeah, self-righteousness.
Yeah. Could I
Self-righteousness.
comment on that briefly? I think you're right, John, but what the way to put that point is that we need to think about ethics in terms of perceptual and responsive skills rather than in terms of judgments. It's when we start trying to turn ethics into a matter of moral judgments about free agents that we end up screwing it up. And so you're right that if I'm, in Dzogchen practice or in Mahamudra practice, I may not be thinking explicitly ethically. But if what I'm doing is dissolving subject-object duality, if I'm dissolving my sense of myself, then what I'm doing is to cultivate the very skills, the cognitive and perceptual skills that underlie the ethical skills that are at the heart of Buddhism, the ethical perceptual skills. And so I think it's just really, really important to think that the framework we want is not the framework of cognitive judgments or utility calculations, but rather the framework of the development of perceptual expertise in order to think about what moral cultivation is in a Buddhist framework.
Yes.
And everything that's important.
From the Buddhist perspective, it would be called an appropriate response.
That's right.
Yeah.
Appamada.
A Tibetan friend of mine once told me, he said that Buddhist ethics is about one thing. It's about transforming oneself from being reactive to being responsive. And I think it's just a gorgeous way to encapsulate it.
Yeah, and if I can add just one thing to underscore what you just said, Jay, which I very much agree with, is Western philosophy and the way we have thought about ethics is entirely declarative. We have not developed a procedural approach to ethics. And what we're talking about is really a procedural approach to ethics, which is based on an entirely different form of learning.
Could I ask you, Richie, to be a little less broad in your West bashing, though? It's fair to say that there are Western traditions that ignore moral perception and this kind of moral tuning. But if you were to pay attention, for instance, to the British sentimentalist tradition, philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith, and Bernard Mandeville, you'd be seeing something much closer to the Buddhist perspective. So while I very much adore Buddhist ethics, I very much recoil at West bashing.
Thank you for the corrective.
We now know that we should refer to Jay as a sentimentalist.
You may do that.
I wanted to just add an utterly concrete example of this discussion of ethics and mindset, and that is using the example of science and research. So we have a crisis of climate that is global, a crisis of this coronavirus, and the lack of vaccination. And His Holiness several weeks ago highlighted in his statement to the world the call for science as a guide, the call for global collaboration. And our whole system of science is incredibly motivated by individual gain, the reward system, the competition, the companies behind things. And we think of it as this pure, right? It's a service. But so how do we change this system to be a global endeavor? And I absolutely love what I heard from Jay and John about this social world that we have, our sense of how let's just say, how connected we are, how we view others is completely a construction we have in our mind. Yes, some people are physically more surrounded by others, but they can still feel lonely. And so likewise, our view of ethics, interdependence, ethical responsibility to others we don't know on the other side of the world, is completely up to us to, as John said, rewrite this cultural narrative. Yeah. There is a set of guidelines coming out from the Nobel Laureate Committee by Elizabeth Blackburn, who has been influenced by this thinking, that calls for an ethical guidelines. It's a Hippocratic oath of science. And it does, it talks about honesty, integrity, and the need for global collaboration. This is not this is not a goal. This is now about our life and death. We need the vaccination just as an example of how much we need to work together. And I want to say that even though as science, we think of ourselves as servants, and as many of you listening are in a service field. So it's very familiar to say you're going to take a Hippocratic oath, an ethical, accept an ethical code in your work, because the underlying fundamental driver for you is love and helping others. But why aren't we expanding this to every profession and to businesses? There is a way to conduct business with the same framework in an ethical manner so that it's not at odds with human and global health.
Yeah. Can I jump in and say something? And this will be somewhat surprising because in some ways, I'd like to partially disagree with a lot of the things that were said, but I'd like to make it in a positive way and partially share my experience. I completely understand and appreciate and value, and I see the importance of enhancing the values of connectivity and interdependence in, let's say, Western society, the typical Western societies, North America, excepting Mexico, of course. But having grown up in a rather typical Eastern society, in a country that was deep behind the Iron Curtain at the time when I was growing up, I experienced the other opposite of extreme interconnectivity, extreme interdependence, and effectively a systematic devaluation of the values of individual freedom and autonomy. And I can share with you how oppressive that felt. It feels just as oppressive as the devaluation of connectivity and interdependence that I'm experiencing right now in a Canadian Western context. So this experience has led me to believe that ethics cannot possibly be defined as interdependency, because what we really need to do, and maybe that is the basis for a universal ethics system that we need to work on, we need to think of ourselves as individuals and as a society as capable of a diversity of forms of interactions and functioning. Yeah. And some of those forms are individualistic and some of those forms of collectivistic and interdependent. And if we try to cull one and emphasize the other, we lead to dysfunction and ill health. And so I completely understand the impulse from Western perspective to completely, from my perspective, idolize the value of interconnectivity. And I think there's absolutely enormous value to it, but we cannot idolize it in isolation to all the other ways in which we evolved to operate. As human beings, we evolved to collaborate, we evolved to compete, we evolved to do all these things. And if we decide to build a society that would privilege only one of those and suppress the others, we'll be building a society that will make us suffer.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, Colleen, is very important. There are as many moral platforms as there are individuals. There's extraordinary variability in what is viewed. as what is moral. But I feel like what we're looking at is trying to understand where harm is present and where happiness is present, and to create the conditions individually and also collectively to reduce harm and to enhance happiness. So this is, I think, is one of the things that we don't want to lose. We can't lose touch with. It is, I feel, you know, the sort of basic imperative that we're facing right now, where the harm is so vivid.
Thank you, Roshi.
Maybe one quick thing I'd just say about, and I think that's a very important insight, Kalina, and I don't actually make that equation between like the ethics and interdependence for myself personally. But what I think there's one way of thinking about that balance, you know, in a kind of more philosophical perspective, is that both of those extremes are incoherent. So the completely isolated individual actually is an impossibility, because individual identity, you know, both empirically in terms of how we absorb, you know, even for example, language and many other cultural forms. We inherit these, we absorb them from our environment. But also philosophically, you can't really define an individual without a context. But the other extreme is also philosophically incoherent. Complete interdependence requires difference. If you don't have nodes, so to speak, individuals, they can't be in relation. So like a kind of radical interdependence that somehow effaces the nodes, that eliminates the individuals, is just as incoherent as one that eliminates the interdependence. So both of those, there needs to be some kind of a balance between those.
Thanks, John. Something that Francisco Varela was very articulate about, this at the same time interconnectivity and autonomy as defining the, you know, the very nature of life. We've been talking about things very relevant to what in Buddhism is called view. An aspect of this, and Kalina had brought up view in the beginning of her talk, an aspect of view has to do with non-duality, a focus for both Jay and John in their talk. So I wonder if there's more to be said about that too, as we move toward the end of our period of time today, to draw some of those connections.
So you're asking whether there's more to be said about the ineffable? There's always so much to say about what can't be said.
Yeah, the Zen is very good at that. Go ahead,
What
Jay.
did you have in mind in particular, though?
Well, the you know, one of the things that Kalina drew our attention to was how this connects with the kind of the diversity of mental modes. And so maybe Kalina might respond initially, and because you had made reference to that fairly quickly, and maybe worth a little expanding.
Yeah, for sure. And that very much relates to the last point that I made, which is just like as a society, we have different modes of connecting with each other that are all necessary. And in the same way within our own minds.
Are we waiting for Jay to respond?
I was thinking that Jay could respond to my comment. So within our own minds, we have these modes. Sorry, am I speaking out of turn?
No. I was hoping that you were going to go further.
Nice.
Okay, so let me go a bit further and you can jump in.
I was waiting, yes.
And the challenge that I wanted to pose here to some of the things that you said earlier, and maybe I misinterpreted what you said, so please correct me if I did, was about that, the goal of achieving, and maybe that was John's talk as well, but the value of this, or the value of labeling the subject-object distinction as an experience as a delusion or an illusion, And I wanted to bring that up because it's very important. It relates to these ethical considerations that we've been discussing. And that came up on a number of occasions as to, well, if it's always an illusion, then what happens to our responsibility, an ethical responsibility?
Okay.
So I feel like, from my perspective, neuroscience, I have a solution to that problem, right? Because to me, the subject-object type of modality of experience that we have is just one of the modes. And another mode is the non-dual type of experience that we can very rarely access. And there's different ways to access it. One is through very long and systematic and dedicated meditation practice. Another one is through some serotonergic psychedelics, including psilocybin. So there's this ability that we have to experience that mode, as well as the one about the subject-object distinction. And to my mind, neither of them is more illusory than the other. They're just different modes that we can experience and different ways in which our brains can become configured to exist. So from my perspective, of labeling one or the other illusory doesn't make sense, as long as, I mean, we can label all of them illusory, and I will be on board with that. So then everything is a fiction, and I would agree with that. But as it was pointed out, within fiction, some things are more useful than others. And so it's not a matter of what's illusory, it's a matter of what we evolved to do and what's the diversity of modes that we evolved to do, and how to assure that we have access to all of these modes.
Good. So
Thanks.
let me respond to that then.
Please.
We're not very far apart. And let me begin by talking once again about the way that I'm using the word illusion. And I'm using it in a very, very specific way. That is, I'm going to use the Indian and Tibetan definition of illusion here. It's something that exists in one way but appears in another. That doesn't mean, to be an illusion is not necessarily a bad thing. And illusions are often necessary and are often useful. We're obviously wired for illusions. We're wired for lots of illusions. We're wired for the Mueller-Lyer illusion. We're wired for, dozens and dozens of illusions. And often these are very useful illusions. And we're wired for the subject-object duality illusion. What we're wired to do there is to take the way the world appears to us as structured by subject and object as simply the way the world is, and we just happen to record it that way in consciousness. That's the illusion that I worry about. The illusion is taking something that's constructed and treating it as though it's something primordial. Now, that doesn't mean one should now escape it. Very often it's necessary to think in terms of subject-object. As one of my favorite Tibetan teachers, Geshe Topka, said to me once when we were talking about this, if you don't have subject-object duality, you can't even make tea, right? You need to be able to have objects of knowledge and subjects of knowledge. But the illusion comes when you then take that, which has a mode of existence, which has a mode of appearance as primordial, to take it as existing in this fundamental way and not as constructed. And so what I'm urging is the need to understand, in order to understand our own cognition, to understand our own moral attitudes, to understand our own way of being, it's really important to distinguish what we do from what we find. And in fact, we end up not finding anything. We end up doing a lot. We construct a world. And we construct a world in a way that occludes that very construction. That's what I mean when I call it an illusion. And I think that Husserl is right, that it's very natural for us to take things this way. It's called a natural attitude. Being natural doesn't make it accurate. Seeing the Mueller-Lyer illusion is natural. It doesn't mean that it makes it an accurate estimate of the relative lengths of two lines. So it's one thing to understand what's natural. It's another thing to understand why it's natural. Another thing to understand the circumstances in which it's beneficial. But yet another thing to say, and it's the way the world is and we faithfully recorded it. That's where we hit illusion. And that's where I think we hit problems. The problems become severe ethically because of everything that's wrapped up into the idea of the transcendent subject. And part of what's wrapped up into the idea of the transcendent subject is this standing outside of the world as an agent, as a witness, that makes a hash out of our cognitive life, our embodied life, our moral life. And that kind of comes in train with that. And that's also part of the natural attitude, to see me as like the eye in the visual field. That's an illusion. It's an illusion that I can understand, but I also have to understand that I need to transcend it. So as I said at the very beginning of my talk, if I'm glossing Dogen, I'm talking about painted rice cakes. It's paint all the way down. The trick is not to give up on the paint, but to recognize paint for what it's worth. And it's just paint. That doesn't mean you stop painting, but it means you know the difference between painting and not painting.
Thank you, Jay. We've come to the end of our period of time for the discussion, but I saw, Jonathan, do you have something brief you might be able to add?
Yes, I just wanted to point out the dangers of using the term illusion on the public. We did research in which we exposed people to the view that the belief in free will was an illusion, and this is a commonly held view promoted in neuroscience and philosophy. And we found that when people were exposed to that view, they were actually more likely to cheat in a laboratory context. And other studies have also found sort of when you tell people that free will is an illusion, it undermines their pro-social behavior. So while in a certain sense, we can call all of these things illusions, we should be wary of our words and recognize that telling people that the self is an illusion could have significant impact on their moral behavior.
Mm.
That's
And
why it's necessary.
I just want to say thank you, Jonathan, because that was exactly my point. And actually, I'll take it further. It's not just unhelpful in societal and moral ways. I would argue that it's also not necessarily defensible in scientific ways either, because the experience of non-duality could easily be perceived as constructed just as much as the experience of duality.
That's what I just
So
said.
that sounds like a
just
conversation for a different occasion.
No, but that's what I just said. There is paint
Yeah.
all the way down.
paint all the way down.
Paint all the way down.
Non-duality is an
As well.
illusion too. Definitely.
Well,
Then the word illusion is not necessarily
So,
helpful.
no, here's the point. Here's the point.
Uh-oh.
One thing, I just say this real quick. One thing, I think if our like natural models of the self were so great, things would probably be a lot better right now. So I don't think that we're starting from a place where kind of what's naturally given to us is like without a problem. And the idea here is not actually, and I'll maybe say we can use the word self. It's not to say that there is, the idea of self and world or person and world is a problem. It's the way we conceptualize that. And just to reinforce what Jay was saying, it's the way we take that sense of subjectivity and turn it into something that couldn't possibly exist. A kind of, like a self that stands outside of the flow of causality and somehow manipulates it, which is the classic view of free will. And actually, if that makes people, behave less morally, then that doesn't mean we should give them that illusion, because that illusion has not been working out very well. Maybe we need a different illusion, like the illusion of non-duality. So I don't think that, so I think it's the position here is that it's not subject-object duality per se, it's the way we hold it, or one term that's used in Tibetan is dzimba or shemba. There's a clinging to it. Like, we need this, we must have this, don't let go of this. But that is precisely that emotional relationship to that schema of ourself. That's the issue at hand. It's not getting rid of the schema itself. It's the way in which we are holding that schema, so to speak.
thank
So,
you, John.
John, thank you. Thank you, Jay. And I want to offer a special thanks to the translators and also to the Niracara Institute and our Brazilian friends who provided so much support for what we're doing, and to Upaya's team and the faculty. I just would like to conclude with the most simple and practical perspective. I've been deeply moved, and feel very energized by the conversations that we've been having and the perspectives that we've been exploring. And also, I'm very aware, acutely aware, that across our country and many of our big cities and also our small towns, there are riots, there's violence, there's grave unrest, and that we're also in the grip of a global pandemic, as well as in the grip of climate catastrophe. And everything that we've said about the self and the deconstruction of it, I think is extremely relevant. One perspective that is very important here at UPI, and I think we share this perspective, is the importance of cultivating the attitude of a bodhisattva in order to dismantle the toxic views that have led to violence, not only in ourselves, but in our world. And this attitude is an attitude that is characterized by fundamental generosity, generosity of view, and also generosity of possibility. And as some of you know who've been to the Varela Symposium here at UPI, every night at the end of the evening, we chant the 4 vows of the Bodhisattvas. And those vows are instantiated, if you will, within the spirit or within the heart mind of what we are endeavoring to bring forward in the Varela Symposium. And those vows are simple, but they are a world too. And they are, if you will, the platform or the means where our world making, I believe, can reduce harm. And the vows are, creations are numberless. And that includes our narratives, our schema, all of the thoughts, words, maps, propositions that we have created, but also all of the creations in the world. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them all. The second vow is delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. And the third vow, reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. And the fourth vow is the awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. And then we offer the night chant at the end of the evening. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken. Awaken. Do not squander your life. So our hope as a small community of people inquiring to the best of our ability as to what is the nature of the mind, reality in this world, is that we will not squander this time, but whatever we have learned together, whatever moments of communion, of joy, of connection that we've experienced together, that we can actually bring that to the benefit of beings everywhere. So I would like to thank all of you so much for being with us. And we hope to gather again next year in the spirit of Francisco Varela and to continue this inquiry. But also Francisco emphasized the importance of our lived experience and making our understanding, our wisdom actionable in the world. And I think that is an imperative today. to deconstruct the toxic views that have given rise to great suffering. So thank you so much. May your life go well, and may you benefit many beings.
Thank you, Roshi.